All right, everyone, welcome back to this week's lecture. This week we are going to be going over audio effects and automation in Pro Tools. This is kind of like your last new unit of stuff. And these two areas are kind of my favorite when it comes to working with a DAW, whether it's recording or production. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you guys about this week. We're going to first start to talk about audio effects, though. In the last series that I was talking about effects loop and submixes, we actually used reverb as an example in our effects loop. I've actually moved that over to here now, just so that way we can focus on one at a time. But the first audio effect we are going to open up is called EQ, or equalization. And I want you to go ahead and add an insert into your assignment 5 project for now. You should go to multi-channel plugin, EQ, and then EQ 7 band. So here we have our EQ. It's come up, and EQ is an audio effect that is going to work with frequencies. And going back to our main elements of sound, we have, of course, frequency, amplitude, timbre, and envelope. Now, we actually have seen EQ used in a number of places in our lives already. If you ever used like media players on your computers, like iTunes or back in the day, QuickTime or Windows Media Player, these all had these EQ settings for like rock, hard rock, metal, classical, jazz, pop, etc. And what that would actually do is that had a preset EQ setting to tweak the frequency output of your music to fit what typically is heard in rock music or metal music or whatever setting it was that you picked. Just like how when Beats headphones first came out, they were meant for hip hop, which I think I talked about in the microphone and audio equipment unit. And those headphones were meant to enhance the areas of frequency that hip hop music usually was written in. So you had a lot in the bass, you had a lot on the high hand for your bass and your snare or your clap or your high frequency kind of percussive hit, and then you had the human voice kind of in the middle. But EQ can be used to bring out more of a sound for something that's been recorded. It can also be used to kind of sculpt the sound of something as well. And I'm going to go over how this plugin works just generally. This is going to be very similar to any other EQ that you see in another software or DAW. And we're first going to look down here at these colored filters. Each one of these areas, these 5 down here and these 2 up here, are filters because they can filter out sound. And what these are going to do is they are either going to boost or reduce frequencies in this band of the frequency that we can hear. And so each of these 5 colored filters down here, we have a low filter, we have a low mid, we have a mid frequency, we have a high mid filter, and a high filter. And so that's going to be high frequencies, high mid frequencies, low mid frequency, and low frequency filter. So the way this is going to work is you have a gain knob at the very bottom. And this is going to, as you can see on my screen, this is going to adjust how far the sound is being boosted or reduced from wherever you set it. Now, the center of that filter is going to be set by this frequency knob right here. So this is going to determine where that frequency is actually going to be set over right there. And I'm going to undo that. I actually want to leave it at 1000 hertz. You can also type into here if you can't quite get it to go to the exact spot. And then lastly, we have this Q. A Q is going to be the width of that filter, how wide around the center of that filter it is going to affect sound. And so you can use all 3 of these settings to really give some different changes to sound, to voices or instruments or whatever it is you're working on. And then lastly, this in button is going to turn a filter on and off. We may not always need all of these, or you may want to compare. It's pretty good practice to compare what something sounds like by hearing it with the filter on, and then with the filter off, and then with the filter on, etc., etc. Now, we also have a couple different filter shapes that we can use as well. I'm going to go down to my low filter, and I'm going to bring that up. And you notice it has a different shape than my mid filter did. This is called a shelf filter. And this shape, which is very similar to what my mid filter is doing, is a notch or a parabolic filter. And it's called that because it looks like a parabola. And sometimes it's called a notch because you can literally take notches out. You can also adjust the gain of each of these filters just by grabbing that dot associated with each one. And so this would be like taking a notch out of the frequencies over here around 886 hertz. So our low filter can do a parabolic filter. It can also do a shelf filter. Now, a shelf filter means that it's going to maintain the point at which your filter is set till the end because it's on the low end, and we'll see it can do the same on the high end as well. So this is like reducing all the low frequencies around 100 hertz and below. And if you want it to be affecting less of that, but you just want to take off the very bottom end, maybe something has too much bass, it's a little too boomy, you can use this low shelf filter to kind of just take a little bit off the edge of the very lowest frequencies we can hear. Which again, that range of frequencies we can hear goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. The same thing can be seen over here on your high frequency or your high filter. Up here, we have the shelf filter on. I can also go to the parabola or the notch filter mode as well. But I'm actually going to turn these two off right now, or three off. And we're going to look up here at our high pass filter, which is represented by HPF, and our low pass filter for LPF. And we're going to turn the high pass filter on. Now, these pass filters sometimes will have different names. There's a high pass filter, and we have, of course, low pass filter, but we can also have a low cut filter and a high cut filter. Now, these are going to mean the same things depending on what area of the frequency we're looking at. In these, we only have a Q and a frequency. We cannot control the gain. That's because these are just removing frequencies. As you can kind of start to see since I turned this filter on, I'm going to bring up the Q on that, which we still have. But rather than making the width of that filter wider or smaller, it is actually just affecting the rate at which frequencies are being cut off, which is, it was at 24 decibels per octave, and then we have 18, 12, and 6. Now 6 decibels per octave is going to be a very gradual kind of cutoff, and as you can see from its shape, it's not really going to be a hard cut where anything below, right now we're at 77 hertz, it's just going to be gone. It's going to be a very slow, gradual effect to the sound. But if I turn it all the way up, this is pretty much as sudden as you can get. Pretty much everything below, if you look down your graph, about 50 hertz is going to be inaudible. So this is going to be a high pass filter because everything above 77 hertz is going to be allowed to pass through. This is also sometimes called a low cut filter because it's cutting everything below 77 hertz. And these terms can be used interchangeably. It just depends maybe on what you're thinking of. You're thinking of maybe I want to preserve the higher frequencies, so you may call it a high pass filter, or you may say I really don't need all this low stuff that's coming out on here. I have way too much bass coming from my electric bass, and I want to make sure that my kick drum can come through because they're going to kind of be in that same range. And so you can use maybe the term low cut, but again, they're going to function exactly the same. It's just the names might be different depending on the software you're using or the plugin you're using. Then I'm going to turn the high pass filter off. I'll turn my low pass filter on, and this is going to function very similarly, except rather than focusing on removing the low frequencies, it's going to focus on removing the high frequencies, as you can see here. And so I have this all the way up on 24 decibels per octave, so it's pretty sudden, and it's going to cut off. I have it set at 1.72 kilohertz, and this can go all the way down to 120 hertz. And so this will actually end up cutting out a lot of sound. And the result of using EQ on sound is not just cutting out frequencies, but it is actually going to change the timbre of the sound that you have. And that is because timbre, again, is determined on overtones. And so even though you may have like an electric bass and it's playing bass notes, which are going to be down here in your frequency spectrum, you would actually still have overtones coming out up here. And so if you were to bring that low pass filter down, you would actually be cutting off all of the overtones. And so the timbre of that sound is going to change significantly. Now, EQ can also be used in mixing. A lot of times if you have two or more instruments that are kind of playing in the same frequency range, like I said before with the electric bass and a kick drum, you can use EQ to kind of carve out a hole for one or the other to come through. So you could take this low mid filter, bring it down like here, but make it a pretty narrow Q right where the kick drum would come through. Let's say the kick drum is coming through at about 42 hertz. But your electric bass is taking up a little bit more frequencies. So you can kind of carve out this hole in the frequency spectrum from the bass, so that way the kick drum can come through. Because the bass can change notes, it's going to change pitch, it's going to have overtones and all that good stuff. But your kick drum might be pretty muted, and a kick drum generally does not change pitch. So if you just kind of carve out that hole for the kick drum to come through, it'll be able to blend really well with the bass, and the kick drum will still be heard. Now, when it comes to using EQ, generally, what I recommend doing for not even just EQ, for any plugin, what I recommend you do is look for presets to start with, because this is going to tell you how this audio effect works, kind of what are the standard subsets that you can start from, and then you can always, of course, tweak this. This goes for instruments as well. I think we talked about that when we were in our MIDI unit, where I said you can start with these presets from all of your instrument inserts, and then go through and tweak a few things and see how it changes it, and if you like it, keep it. If you don't. But up here, under the word preset, we have a whole lot of presets. And I'm going to go down to vocals. And since we have our effects loop on vocal tracks, let's see if we can add some presence. And so when we go to add presence, it's really going to enhance from about 500 hertz up. And that high mid filter is based at 5,000 hertz. Or 5 kilohertz, and it has a pretty wide Q at 0.3. And so I'm going to go ahead and play from right here. It's about 20 seconds in. Or actually, let's hear with the backup vocals. I'm going to start a little bit before the backup vocals come in, a little bit before 40 seconds. I'm going to hit play, and we'll hear what it sounds like.
Waking up with you's enough to bring back a breakdown. Don't be me, any other scene. Pretty girl like you could take a man for his tight look. Can't you see?
Okay, so I want to compare that now. So I'm actually going to turn off my EQ filter, and I'm not going to delete it. But instead I'm actually just going to bypass it. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to say bypass. You can also turn that on with this bypass button up here in the filter, or in the plugin or insert itself. And then I'm going to go back here and I'm going to turn it on and off.
Waking up with you's enough to bring back a breakdown. Don't be me, any other scene. Pretty girl like you could take a man for his tight look. Can't you see?
Yeah, so it adds a little bit of presence, I mean, like it suggests. It adds a little bit of presence to the voice, so maybe it can stick out a little bit more in a mix. And it's being able to do that by kind of enhancing the overtones of the male voices that you have there. There are some specific vocal presets, like we have a solidify male vocals, which is going to really boost that lower end. Let's hear what that sounds like.
Waking up with you's enough to bring back a breakdown. Don't be mean. Any other scene. Pretty girl like you could take.
Yeah, it does add a little bit of presence down at the bottom. So that's pretty cool. So let's take a look at some of the other ones. There are some pretty eccentric presets in here. I always like to go to the cell phone. There's also some interesting ones called like inside the club or outside the club that are going to give the illusion of being inside like a nightclub or being outside of a building when you're hearing something. But cell phone always has a very interesting sound, so I want to hear that.
Waking up with you's enough to bring back a breakdown. Don't be mean. Any other scene. Pretty girl like you could take a man for his tight luck.
Yeah, so if you compare that to without having that preset on there, you're going to tell that it really is cutting out a lot of the sound. Now, because of our routing, we are actually still hearing the original audio recordings coming out through tracks 15 and 16, and so we're kind of getting a blend of the two. But if we were to actually put this just directly onto oh, sorry, that can't work because that's stereo and I can't put it on mono. But if I were to maybe move this over to our submix where we have a stereo, you would hear it's a huge change in the quality of that sound or the texture of that sound, because everything is basically being cut off below about 900 hertz. And then above, looks like about above 4,000 or 5,000 hertz, and so you're really getting this like tinny cell phony sound, and it's pretty funny. It's kind of more of maybe a gimmick, or it's like more like sound effects, but it's pretty fun to hear how that's going to affect the sound of something. So for part of your assignment this week, guys, is I want you to go through each one of these effects, and you're going to find some presets that you liked. You're going to tell me which track you put it on, how it affected that sound, and why you liked it. And so this has been EQ7, and in the next little bit, we are going to look again at Deverb. All right, so now we are going to go over Deverb, which is a reverb plugin. Now, we can change between inserts or audio plugins right here in the insert kind of bar up at this top. Instead of saying EQ band 3, we could, or band 7, we could go to reverb and change it there. But I actually already have it up in my submix track. So I'm going to go ahead to here and just hear my submix real quick. So I'm going to make sure that I have all of my drum tracks soloed for my submix, so that way they can be sent over to the submix aux track. There we go. Now I already have Deverb on here. And we kind of just threw it on there as an example last week, and so I actually want to dig through this a little bit more with you guys. So the main control when it comes to reverb is going to be decay. Now, reverb is actually meant to recreate the reverberations of a space digitally, or back in the olden days when we had analog, it was actually doing it through analog reverb. What happened is acoustic scientists have gone around and recorded and analyzed how reverbs happens in a space, and figured out how to actually replicate it using thousands of calculated delays. And what a delay is going to do is it's going to repeat the sound at a certain interval of time from when it happens to when you actually hear the delay. And then they also adjust how that delayed sound comes out. Typically, reverb is going to have a lot more high frequencies to it, because the lower frequencies are going to get absorbed more, or they're not going to be reflected as much because they're much slower. They get absorbed by more of like the people in a space or chairs. And so the higher frequencies are going to resonate a lot more because they have more energy to them. And so reverb really comes down to decay and the amount of high frequencies you can hear. Now, just in Deverb, we have a couple buttons that can allow us to change our reverb pretty quickly. For instance, we have the size of a space, and then actually kind of like presets for certain types of spaces up here. So currently I'm on a large hall, which has a pretty big boomy sound if you're listening to that. If we were to switch to maybe a medium hall, you notice the decay time went down to 3.4 seconds. And then, of course, that means that the amount of reverb we're hearing is a little bit less. It's not taking as long to go away. And then a small hall is even less. You also have like churches. You also have a plate reverb, which is kind of more of, it's not really based on a room, but it's based more on a timbre within a reverb. And then we have 2 different rooms that you can choose from. We have an ambient and then a non-linear reverb. Now we do have our presets up above as well, and we are gonna have a chance to go through those again too. But you can honestly get a lot of different reverb options just with these buttons right here. Now, if you ever wanted to try out reverb on your own and you kind of want to tweak some of these presets, one of the first things you can do is adjust the amount of decay. Typically, if you don't want an instrument or you don't want your project to sound like it's in a big space, you're not going to have a lot of decay. Anything more than 2 seconds is going to start to sound like it's in a room. One of the benefits, though, to having a little bit of reverb is it makes it sound a little bit more natural, a little bit more organic, because if we just listen to these drums without any reverb on them, it sounds like it's very, what I would call forward. It sounds like it's right in front of us. But if I put that reverb back on, it sounds a little bit more distant because it's taking longer for each sound coming from the drums to kind of decay and fade away. And decay, of course, is coming from back at the beginning of the year, we have our envelope parts. We have attack, decay, sustain, and release. And so decay and thus reverb is actually kind of adjusting the last 3 parts of that sound envelope. The original sound is providing the attack, and then the reverb is altering the envelope of that sound. It's going to be a much more gradual decay, sustain, and release. It may even happen longer than otherwise. Another thing I wanted to show you guys is this high frequency cut. And I'm going to let this play while I kind of adjust this, and I would recommend you guys try this after I'm done. But so I have my high frequency cut is at 15 kilohertz, and if I bring that down, it kind of sounds a little bit more dead, you could say. And that is because what HF cut is doing is it's that point at which it's cutting high frequencies. Again, from when we were talking about EQ, you have a pass filter, and it's also sometimes called a cut filter. So in this instance, this is also called a low pass or a high cut filter, and we are cutting all of the frequencies above 6 kilohertz, which is pretty high to begin with. But if we compare 6 kilohertz to 16 kilohertz, it sounds much boomier. So if you're finding that it's a little bit too resonant maybe, and you wanted to bring that down a little bit, but it's not necessarily because of the time, and it's more because of the timbre, I would recommend then that you experiment with that high frequency cut on there. Then down at this bottom, we have a dry wet mix. Now this is a very common control you're going to see across all sorts of audio effects, and this has to do with the presence of that effect in the overall mix of your sound. Now, we also talked about what wet and dry was last week when we were looking at an effects loop, and what this means is a wet signal is going to be one, especially if it's 100% wet, like we see here, that's going to be all of the sound of the effect getting passed through, where if you were to have it at dry, or on 0% of the effect, it's the original unaffected sound. And so if you were to put that then at 50%, you get an even blend between the reverb result after it passes through the effect and the original dry sound from before. So this is another way to control how much of that reverb is coming through. So if it's too boomy, it's too much, but you like the tail, you just don't want to hear it as much, you can just essentially turn down the gain on your reverb by changing the mix between wet and dry. You could also try experimenting with the size of your space or a different space, or simply the decay time, and also, of course, that high frequency cut. Now, when it comes to the presets, there's a pretty large number. And they're also going to, some of them will change the timbre quite a bit, like canned will makes it sound like it's kind of on the other side of a wall. It's pretty narrow. And then something like large hall dark is going to give it a very different timbre too, because this high frequency cut and this low pass filter, they're doing kind of two different things at the same time, and it's going to affect that timbre because it's affecting frequency. So that's just a little introduction into your Reverb plugin. So part of your assignment again this week is you're going to tell me 2 presets that you liked for this, and then 2 that you didn't. So you'll go through these presets for reverb and tell me what you liked. I am not talking about just choosing like what small, medium, or large in one of these. I actually mean going through these lists of presets and finding one that you think sounds good with these drums, or if you wanted to stay and do it with the vocals, just be sure to tell me which one you liked with what track. So now what we're going to do is we are going to look at another major audio effect called compression. And the 3 that I've talked about, or the 2 and this one that I've talked about so far, are kind of your big 3 audio effects. EQ, reverb, and compression will be on just about every kind of software, audio software that you can imagine. It's going to be on a lot of, if not most, or all digital mixers. You'll see EQ on mixers themselves. You may also see some mixers that have analog mixers that have reverb digital plugins on them, or they maybe have some amount of compression, but these 3 are pretty important. So to bring up our compressor, I want to stay on our submix track, and I'm just going to replace our reverb with Dyne 3 compressor and limiter. That is under the dynamics kind of category, and then that brings up our compressor. Now, a compressor is going to be used for volume, amplitude, loudness, whatever it is you want to call it. So all the 4 components of sound, or those elements of sound, are coming back now. We've talked about envelope with how we can use reverb to kind of adjust or change the tail or the decay, sustain, and release of a sound envelope. We can use EQ filters to adjust frequency and thus also change the timbre of a sound. And compression is going to be about volume. So the first few controls I want to show you guys are gain and threshold. The way that I think of compression is it's not like if you were to export, if you have like an image file and you're in something like Photoshop and you go to export it, you're going to compress it because it's a big file and you don't want one image to take up half of your hard drive. This is more about compressing the volume range in a track or in a project. Now, what's going to happen is you can think of raising the gain, which is going to globally raise the gain of all of your track or all of your project, however this is being routed. Currently, of course, we're on our submix aux track, which means that all of our drums are going through that, which means that all of our drums would be going up 8 decibels. Now, if I go ahead and hit play on this, we see that we're already pretty high on here. We're already getting up to about 7 or 8. So if I were to bring that up, that's actually with the compressor on. So if I actually turn the compressor off, wow, we almost peaked, very close to that. But that's okay. This is kind of what the point of compression is. So if I turn this back on, what gain is going to do is it's going to bring everything up. So if you have a track that has a pretty big range of volume, but it's not really being heard when it's softer, but when it's louder, it's actually getting too loud and it's peaking, kind of like what ours was doing up here. You can use gain to bring everything up. And then what this threshold is going to do is it's going to be the threshold at which your compressor is going to start slowly or abruptly adding gain reduction. And this will prevent your track from peaking. So as we saw when I accidentally had to turn on, and I have this going, I don't have any gain added, but all of my drums came down quite a bit. And if we're looking over here at my compressor is adding anywhere between, about 3 and 12 decibels of gain reduction. And if I look up at the graph again, if I start that over, this is kind of a great tool to have. I really like having a graphic visualizer for compression because it's showing me where my project's loudness kind of is on its own. This orange line is the line at which compression is going to start happening, your threshold of compression. And so now I moved my threshold up pretty far. And what this is saying is that at minus 13 decibels of volume coming from my tracks, it is going to start adding compression. Now, you can change the amount of compression it adds or how quickly it's going to compress using a couple controls. We have our knee and we have our ratio. And if I go ahead and I start changing my knee, you'll notice it's actually affecting the curve right here. So by having a pretty high decibel knee, it means it's going to be a much more gradual addition of gain reduction. But if I have my knee all the way down to like 0, it's pretty much going to turn on almost as soon as it gets above 13 decibels. And the ratio is another way to control how strong that gain reduction is going to be. And I'm actually going to bring this down just so we can see it a little bit more clearly. It probably won't sound the greatest, but luckily you guys won't be able to hear it. So if I have my ratio all the way down to 101, this is essentially a straight line. It's not really adding compression at all, but if I bring that ratio up, it starts to bring the amount of compression and how fast it's going to be added down, which means that as it gets further and further, or as it gets past that line of my threshold, it's going to start compressing faster and faster the higher my ratio is. And then I'm going to move my threshold up. And then I can make that knee a little bit more round, so it's a little bit more organic. So as my sound is kind of bouncing around that threshold, I can make sure that it's not too obvious. Because it can be very obvious when you have your compressor on, when if all of a sudden one sound is loud and then the next one isn't, and it musically feels like it should be louder, that means that your compressor is too sensitive. And so you can adjust where your threshold is. You can just bring that threshold down. You can smooth out that knee, or you can raise or lower that ratio to kind of tweak that point where your compressor is turning on. Now, there are 2 other controls in here as well. You have an attack and a release knob. Sound familiar? It's from our envelope. So this is going to control how fast your compressor is going to turn on and how long it's going to wait before it turns off. If your sound is kind of like hovering right around your threshold, then it is a good idea to kind of be aware of how fast your compressor needs to turn on and then turn off. But generally, for now, you guys are going to be focusing more on gain and threshold, and then maybe your knee and ratio. I really recommend, if you've never used a compressor before, try using these presets. So I'm going to use a drum preset. Makes sense. We're looking at drums. And I have this on, again, my submix for all of my drums, and I'm going to turn that on. So it actually did turn everything up, but I have a pretty low threshold. And so the result is that if I were to like bounce this as a WAV file or as any kind of audio file and then bring it into my DAW, I would see the waveform is compressed because it's going to be more like, it's going to be fuller than what I have right here. So my waveform would probably be a lot fuller, kind of like this. What instrument is that? Like that hi-hat track, but it'd be filled with everything else underneath it. This drum compressor did make everything pretty flat. There's not a lot of dynamic change. It's all pretty much the same, which if that's what you need, if you need a track to really fill, then that's going to be a great way to do that. I'm actually going to try what this drum attack preset does, which means that this is going to be focusing on really compressing the attack of my drum. So if I'm getting close to peaking, or I am peaking maybe from the attack from my drums, I can put this compression on and see if that works. That actually did a pretty good job. So even looking at my meter, I'm getting kind of close to peaking, but it's always staying away. And if I want it to be a little bit lower, guess what? I can just take my gain down a few decibels, and now I don't have to worry about that. So there's that. So what I want you to do now for, again, part of this audio effect assignment is, rather than going through these and telling me which one you liked, I want you to find one that worked for your drums. And I would really recommend that you probably try using the drums on this, and find one that maybe did not work for these drums as well, okay? Okay, guys, so the last audio effect I want to show you it's a kind of a fun one, and what I want you guys to do is just solo the electric guitar track here, and we're going to open up Mod Delay 3, it's under Delay, and we are going to do the mono/stereo version, and here it is. So what a delay is, and I kind of talked about this with reverb, is a delay is going to repeat a sound that is passed through, delayed, as the name suggests, by a certain amount of time. And so right now we are delaying our electric guitar by 250 milliseconds. And we actually, with this stereo mono version, we have a left and a right control. So if you have headphones on, this is going to be really cool, because we'll be able to hear things happening at different rates in each one of our ears, which can be a lot of fun. But we can actually link our left and right together, and I want you guys to do that with me right now. Just go ahead and click on that link button, and now as you change stuff, they will happen on the both sides together at the same time. So what we can do is, delay is going to have the time that it's going to be delayed is controlled right here by the delay knob, as one might assume, but we can also create delays that happen in time. Now, ideally, we want that to happen in our projects, so I have the sync button on, which is going to override this control here, where I'm not controlling what my tempo or what my meter is. If you really want to get into some cool kind of delay effects, maybe something along the lines of like math rock or something, you can actually turn this sync off, so it's not syncing with my project's meter and tempo down here, and you have an entirely different meter coming through your headphones when you have that off. But for now, we're going to keep it on. So the cool thing about delay is that you can have something happen kind of after that original sound. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on that half note right here. So both sides are going to happen at the same time, a half note off from the original. But you may have noticed that we didn't hear anything for a split second, and that is because our mix is at 100% wet. So we're only hearing the delay, which is starting a half note later than when the signal goes through, and we're not hearing the dry, which is the original signal from our project. So if we go ahead and put 50% in there, so now it's actually happening a half note off. Let's go to a quarter note. Sounds kind of interesting. Then go to an eighth note. Sounds a little bit better, because this is kind of like this laid back kind of vibe to it. Our project is probably also not in the right tempo or meter, because this was recorded in something else, so it is sounding a little funky right now just when we're going through rhythms. But we can actually just turn the amount of time off. And then I want to look at the other part of this, which is the modulation, hence the name mod delay. Now, modulation is going to create this kind of rising and falling sound or motion in the sound as it passes through. Now, because our delay time is down to 0, this is going to happen instantly. And so I'm going to adjust my rate. This is going to be the rate of rising and falling, and the depth means how much you're going to hear it or how big that rise and fall is going to be. So I would recommend try and get it around 10 hertz and about 25% depth. And let's hear what that sounds like. So I brought this down to about 2 hertz. And now this sounds maybe more like a surfer guitar. If I bring the depth up, yeah, that's pretty cool. Maybe a little bit too much, but still not terrible. But I'm going to actually turn off these links. And I'm going to have this one happening on the quarter note. And I'm going to leave this one off. And I'm going to change the rate. That's pretty cool. So I'm actually hearing what the guitar is playing kind of off by a quarter note on my my right ear. And so when you have a project that's in time with itself, so if you've written a song in MIDI, this is a great way to make something sound really complex, is you add that delay, and then you have more hits coming off. You have more things that can be passed around from left to right. And then with mod delay, we can add this modulation sound using our rate and depth, and it's pretty cool. Don't forget, again, change that from 100% wet to 50%, so that way we can hear the original and hear the delay as well. So guys, I'm not going to have this one as part of your assignment. It's just a kind of a fun one that I wanted to show you. I really recommend that you try and play around with this on the guitar track, or maybe on one of the other tracks if you want, maybe on the vocalists. Its modulation is it's a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite audio effects to use. And that is all that we have this week for audio effects. In the next video, I'm going to be talking to you all about automation. It's going to be a little bit shorter than this audio effect video has been, and it is probably one of the last new things that we're going to cover for this semester. So I'll see you in the next one.